the slow decline. Jessica and Michael had been married for nearly 2 decades, and by the time she turned 37, their life had become a monotonous routine. Once filled with passion and romance, their relationship had faded into a gray existence, consumed by daily responsibilities and the endless grind of work and parenting. Michael, at 40, had long since stopped being the attentive and exciting man Jessica had fallen in love with. He no longer surprised her with flowers, whispered sweet nothings, or even acknowledged her efforts to maintain some sense of connection. Instead, their conversations revolved around mundane topics: bills, groceries, and their daughter, Rihanna. Rihanna was 19, a bright and energetic young woman with her whole future ahead of her. But lately, even she seemed to be slipping away. Jessica and Michael had noticed that their daughter was spending more nights away from home, claiming she was with her best friend, Lisa. Jessica trusted her daughter, but something gnawed at her, an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. One evening, Jessica and Michael sat in their quiet living room, the television droning on in the background. Jessica couldn't help but feel the void between them, the silence heavy with unspoken words. She looked over at Michael, who was engrossed in his phone, oblivious to her presence. "Michael," she said, breaking the silence, "have you noticed how often Rihanna's been staying out? She's barely home anymore." Michael didn't look up from his screen. "Yeah, I guess. She's an adult now. Probably just having fun with her friends." Jessica sighed, frustrated by his nonchalance. "She said she's been staying with Lisa, but we don't even know Lisa's parents. I don't like it." Michael finally put his phone down and glanced at her. "She's just a kid. Let her have some freedom." Jessica knew he was right in some ways, but the pit in her stomach told her something wasn't adding up. When Rihanna didn't come home for 3 days, Jessica's worry turned to panic. She tried calling her daughter, but it went straight to voicemail. Desperate, she dialed Lisa's number. "Hi, Lisa. This is Jessica, Rihanna's mom. I'm just calling to check in. Is Rihanna with you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lisa replied, "Oh, no, Mrs. Harris. I've been out of town for work for the past week. I haven't seen Rihanna." Jessica's heart sank. She hung up without saying another word, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Where had Rihanna been? Who was she with? She quickly grabbed her coat and keys, telling Michael what Lisa had said. "We need to go to Lisa's house," Jessica insisted. "Something's not right." Michael, sensing the urgency in her voice, agreed. They drove in tense silence, their thoughts spiraling as they tried to piece together where their daughter could be. When they arrived at the address Rihanna had given them for Lisa's house, Jessica was taken aback. The home was massive, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and 4 luxury cars parked in the driveway. Jessica hesitated before ringing the doorbell, and to her shock, it was Rihanna who answered. Her hair was disheveled, and she was wrapped in nothing but a towel. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" Rihanna stammered, clearly caught off guard. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here? You've been lying to us. You said you were staying with Lisa, but she's been out of town." Before Rihanna could respond, a voice from inside the house called out, "Honey, who's at the door?" Jessica froze. That voice, it was eerily familiar. She pushed past her daughter and stormed into the house, following the sound of the voice. Her worst fears were confirmed when she entered the bedroom and found a man lying on the bed, completely naked. "Who the hell are you?" Jessica demanded, her voice shaking with anger. The man turned, startled by her presence, and then his eyes widened in recognition. "Jessica? Is that you?" Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The man was Robert, her first love from college, the man she had never quite gotten over, the one who had slipped through her fingers all those years ago. Her mind reeled as the past collided with the present, and she stood there, dumbfounded. "Robert?" she whispered, the name barely escaping her lips. He smiled, sitting up in the bed, unashamed of his nakedness. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Jessica was too stunned to speak, her mind racing with a million thoughts. How had she ended up here, in this bizarre and twisted moment, standing in front of the man she had once loved so deeply while her daughter stood just outside the door. Robert's eyes roamed over her, his smile growing more seductive. "You look just as beautiful as I remember, Jess. Maybe even more." Jessica felt a strange pull, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, desire. But she quickly pushed it away, disgusted with herself for even considering it. This was wrong. So wrong. "What the hell is going on here?" she finally spat, her voice trembling with both anger and confusion. Robert leaned back against the headboard, his tone casual, almost playful. "You should know, Jessica. You and we had something special once. Maybe we still do." Jessica's stomach churned, and she turned to leave, but his next words stopped her in her tracks. "Do you really want to go back to that boring life with Michael? I can give you everything you've ever wanted. Everything we missed out on." Jessica's mind spun with conflicting emotions. The man she had once loved was right in front of her, offering her a way out of the dull existence she had been trapped in for so long. But at what cost? Before she could respond, her daughter Rihanna, now fully dressed, rushed into the room, panic written all over her face. "Mom, please, let's just go." But it was too late. Jessica stood frozen in Robert's bedroom, the weight of her daughter's pleading eyes pulling her back into reality. The man she once loved, the one she had fantasized about on more than one lonely night in her cold, silent bed with Michael, was now naked before her, offering an escape from the grayness that had taken over her life. But her daughter, her own flesh and blood, was right there witnessing it all. The shame coursed through her, but that old, dangerous spark Robert ignited was hard to ignore. "Mom, please," Rihanna repeated, her voice cracking. Jessica turned to face her daughter, seeing the confusion, fear, and hurt in her eyes. The girl who had once admired her so much now looked at her with something resembling betrayal. She knew she had to leave this place and never come back. But Robert wasn't going to let her go so easily. "Jessica," Robert said smoothly, getting up from the bed, "you don't have to walk away. Not again." Jessica's heart raced. His words echoed the same ones she had tortured herself with for years after they'd broken up in college. What if? What if she had stayed with him? What if they had tried harder to make things work? Maybe her life would be different now. Maybe she wouldn't feel so numb, so trapped in the endless monotony of a loveless marriage. For a brief second, she allowed herself to imagine it. A life with Robert, away from Michael, away from the silence and resentment that had grown between them like a cancer. But then Rihanna's soft sob broke her reverie. "Mom, I thought you came to find me, not him." Jessica snapped back to the present, her head spinning as she looked from her daughter to Robert. She couldn't believe what she was standing in the middle of. The man she once loved, the daughter she had lost touch with, and her own hollow marriage. "Rihanna, we're leaving," Jessica finally said, her voice firm though her legs felt weak. But Robert wasn't done. He crossed the room with a confidence that reminded her why she had fallen for him all those years ago, his eyes never leaving hers. "Jess, come on, we had something real. You can't tell me you haven't thought about it. Look at you. Don't you miss being wanted? Being alive?" He was dangerously close now, and Jessica's breath hitched as she felt the warmth of his presence. She had spent so long being invisible to Michael, reduced to a background figure in their home. Robert's gaze, full of hunger and adoration, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Seen, desired. She hated how much she wanted that. But as her hand reached for the doorknob to leave, Robert gently grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him with a force that felt as if it had been pent up for years. Her body betrayed her, the memory of his touch so vivid, like a reflex. Their faces were inches apart now, the tension between them thick, electric. And then it happened, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tender like Michael's tired, routine kisses. No, this was a kiss filled with years of what could have been, a collision of passion and anger, love and lust. Jessica let out a soft gasp as her hands instinctively went to his chest, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin. From the corner of her eye, She saw Rihanna backing out of the room in stunned silence. Jessica pulled away from Robert, her mind a chaotic whirlwind. But before she could speak, Robert cupped her face, looking into her eyes with that same intensity he had back in college. "Come on, Jess. You don't need him. You need this. You need me." Jessica's resolve cracked. She felt years of loneliness flooding her heart, a desperate need to feel alive again. The temptation was too much, the pull too strong. And in a moment of weakness, she gave in, pushing aside every warning that screamed in her mind. She kissed him again, this time with more hunger, more desire, more pain. "Robert, what are we doing?" she managed to whisper between breaths. But the answer came not in words, but in the fevered movement of his hands on her body. He led her to the bed, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, Jessica was wrapped up in him, lost in the madness of their reunion. Meanwhile, downstairs, Rihanna had gathered her things in a daze. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew it wasn't something she could handle. The thought of her mother with Robert, of everything unraveling like this, was too much to bear. Tears streamed down her face as she hurried out the door, her heart pounding with betrayal and confusion. She had no idea where to go, but she knew one thing. She had to tell her father. Michael sat in the car, tapping the steering wheel nervously. He had always been a patient man, but today, something felt off. Jessica had been inside for far too long. His mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. He had tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but that unease wouldn't leave him. When he saw Rihanna running out of the house, her face red and tear-streaked, his heart dropped. He leaped out of the car and rushed toward her. "Rihanna, what's going on? Where's your mother?" Rihanna couldn't speak. She just shook her head, sobbing. Michael grabbed her shoulders, his voice growing more frantic. "Tell me what happened. Where's your mother?" She's inside," Rihanna managed to choke out. "With him." "Who?" Michael asked, though his gut already told him the answer. Before Rihanna could respond, a noise from the house made them both turn. A sound Michael hadn't heard in years. A moan. Jessica's moan. Michael's blood ran cold. Without another word, he bolted toward the door, his heart slamming against his ribs as anger and fear propelled him forward. Bursting into the house, he followed the sound, up the stairs, down the hall until he reached the bedroom. And there she was, his wife, naked, on top of a man he didn't recognize at first until he did. Robert. Michael's mind went blank for a moment, the sight burning into his brain, leaving him numb with disbelief. Then, in a surge of fury, it all hit him at once. This wasn't just infidelity, it was betrayal on every level. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, was tangled in the sheets with her first love, the man she had never really let go of. "What the fuck?" Michael bellowed, his voice shaking the walls as he stormed into the room. Jessica froze, her face draining of all color. Robert sat up, startled but eerily calm, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Michael, wait!" Jessica started, scrambling to cover herself with the sheets. But it was too late. Michael's world had already shattered. He turned on his heel, storming out of the house before Jessica could say another word, his heart a wild mix of pain and betrayal. By the time Jessica made it back downstairs, clutching her clothes to her chest, Michael and Rihanna were gone. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. And there, on the kitchen table, was a hastily scrawled note from Michael. "I can't do this anymore. Rihanna and I are leaving. Don't come looking for us." Jessica stood there, trembling, as the weight of her actions crashed down on her. She had lost everything in one reckless, selfish moment. Jessica stood frozen in her kitchen, her eyes locked on the note from Michael. The words blurred as her vision swam with tears. She couldn't believe it, her husband and daughter were gone. The house, once filled with the quiet hum of family life, felt empty, hollow, as if the soul had been ripped out of it in a single, devastating moment. "What have I done?" she thought, the gravity of her actions crushing her chest. For a few moments of reckless passion, She had destroyed everything she had spent 2 decades building. The betrayal, the guilt, the shame. They hit her all at once, like a tidal wave she couldn't escape. She sank to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her, clutching the note to her chest as sobs racked her body. The memory of what had just happened upstairs felt like a bad dream, but the cold reality was undeniable. She had cheated on Michael, her husband, the father of her child, with a man who represented a past she had never fully let go of. After what felt like an eternity, Jessica forced herself to stand. She had to face this. She had to figure out what to do next. But as she stared around the house, the life she had lived there, the memories of family dinners, of laughter and love, seemed so distant now. A life that felt like someone else's. She wanted to call Michael, beg him to come back, to explain, to say that it was a mistake, that she didn't mean for it to happen. But the truth was, she had wanted it. In that moment with Robert, she had felt alive again in a way she hadn't in years. But now, in the harsh light of day, she realized the cost of that fleeting feeling was too high. Much too high. She picked up her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed Michael's number. It rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. Of course. She tried Rihanna next, but her daughter didn't answer either. Jessica's heart clenched as she realized how much she had hurt not just Michael, but Rihanna, too. Her daughter had seen everything. What kind of mother had she become? Desperate, Jessica sent a text to Michael. Please come home. I'm so sorry. We need to talk. I need to explain. But even as she typed it, she knew no explanation could undo what she had done. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her. She couldn't stay here, not in this place that now seemed haunted by her mistakes. Grabbing her keys, she drove aimlessly through town, her mind replaying every detail of the day's events. The way Robert had looked at her, the kiss, the heat of the moment, and then Michael's face, the heartbreak, the anger. She didn't know where she was going until she found herself parked in front of Robert's house again. She hadn't intended to come here, but it was the only place that felt remotely familiar now. The place where everything had unraveled. Robert opened the door, his face softening when he saw her standing there. Eyes red from crying, shoulders slumped in defeat. "Jessica," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She entered without a word, her mind too scrambled to make sense of what she was doing. The same house that had felt exciting, like a forbidden escape, now felt wrong, tarnished. Robert closed the door behind her and gently guided her to the living room. "Talk to me," he said softly, sitting beside her on the couch, his hand resting on her knee. "What happened?" Jessica looked down at his hand, the warmth of it sending confusing signals to her already broken heart. How could she explain to him what had just happened? That her husband had walked in on them? That her daughter had witnessed her betrayal? "They're gone, Robert," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Michael and Rihanna. They left." Robert frowned, but there was no real shock in his expression. He seemed to have expected this. "I'm sorry, Jess," he said quietly, though his words felt distant, almost rehearsed. "But maybe this is for the best. You weren't happy with him, were you?" Jessica stared at him, her mind spinning. Was this what she had wanted? To tear her family apart, to end her marriage? No, she had just wanted to feel something again. She hadn't thought it would go this far. "I didn't want this," she muttered, shaking her head as tears filled her eyes again. "I didn't want to hurt them like this." Robert's hand tightened on her knee, his expression softening. "Look, Jess, I know things are a mess right now, but we can figure this out. You don't have to go back to that life. You and I, we have a connection. We always have." Jessica couldn't believe what she was hearing. Robert was still trying to pull her in, still trying to make her believe that leaving everything behind was the right choice. But was it? Could she really walk away from the life she had built with Michael? From the daughter who now probably hated her? She pulled away from Robert's touch and stood up, her mind racing. "I need to think," she said, pacing the room. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know what's right." Robert stood as well, watching her with a calmness that unnerved her. "You're not alone, Jessica. You don't have to figure this out by yourself. Jessica stopped pacing and faced him. But I do. I've made such a mess of everything. Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her face, trying to hold back the tears. I've hurt them so much. Robert approached her again, placing his hands on her shoulders. You deserve to be happy. Don't forget that. But Jessica wasn't sure what happiness looked like anymore. Everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea how to hold on to any of it. She pulled away from Robert again, feeling suffocated by his presence now. I need space, she said, her voice firmer this time. I need to figure things out on my own. Robert looked at her, his expression unreadable. If that's what you want. It is, Jessica said, though even she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. All she knew was that staying here with Robert felt wrong. She needed to get away to think clearly. Without another word, she left the house, the weight of everything crashing down on her as she stepped out into the cool night air. She didn't know where to go or what to do next, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The past was a dangerous place to live in, and right now she was drowning in it. As she drove away, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from Michael. Her heart leapt as she swiped to open it, desperate for any sign that he was willing to talk. But it wasn't the response she had hoped for. Don't contact me again. It's over. Jessica pulled the car over, her hands shaking as she stared at the words on the screen. The finality of it hit her like a physical blow. Michael was done. And with him went everything she had known for the past 20 years. Her marriage, her family, her sense of security. She had lost it all. The tears came again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She sat in her car on the side of the road, crying for the life she had destroyed, the family she had betrayed, and the woman she no longer recognized in the mirror. Jessica sat in her car for what felt like hours, her phone still glowing with Michael's last message. Don't contact me again. It's over. She read it over and over, hoping the meaning would somehow change, but the finality of it was undeniable. It was done. Everything was done. Eventually, she wiped her tears and started the car again, driving aimlessly through the streets. She didn't know where to go or who to turn to. Robert had been wrong. This wasn't the life she wanted. The fleeting excitement he offered had turned into a nightmare, leaving her lonelier than she'd ever felt before. Her thoughts turned to Rihanna. Jessica's chest ached as she thought about her daughter's face. How stunned and hurt she'd looked when she walked in on her mother with Robert. Jessica had spent years trying to be a good mother, and now it felt like she had shattered the very foundation of her relationship with Rihanna. Would she ever forgive her? She pulled into a parking lot by the beach, one of the few places that had always calmed her. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and she rolled down her windows, letting the salty breeze in. The memories of family trips to this very beach flooded her mind. Rihanna running into the waves as a little girl, Michael chasing after her, laughter filling the air. Now all that was gone. It was just Jessica, sitting alone in her car, a stranger to the life she had once cherished. She closed her eyes, the guilt pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. How did it come to this? Meanwhile, Michael and Rihanna were checking into a small motel just outside of town. Michael had driven without a word, his mind too clouded with anger and disbelief to speak. Rihanna had sat beside him, silent, her own emotions a tangled mess of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. She had seen everything, her mother in a compromising position with a man she barely knew. It didn't seem real. When they got to the room, Michael tossed his bag on the floor and collapsed onto one of the beds, staring blankly at the ceiling. Rihanna sat on the edge of the other bed, still trying to process what had happened. "Dad?" Rihanna's voice was soft, almost afraid to break the silence. Michael didn't answer at first, his jaw clenched as he fought back the storm of emotions raging inside him. "How could she do this?" he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "How could your mother do this to us?" Rihanna had no answer. She had no idea how her mother had gone from being the woman who raised her, who she looked up to this stranger who had destroyed their family in one reckless moment. The image of her mother with Robert, the moans, the shock on Jessica's face when she was caught. It was burned into Rihanna's mind, a scar that wouldn't fade anytime soon. "I don't know, Dad," Rihanna whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know." Michael turned to look at his daughter, seeing the pain etched across her face, and his heart broke even more. He had been so focused on his own anger and betrayal that he hadn't thought about how this was affecting her. Rihanna had been caught in the middle of it all, witnessing her mother's affair firsthand. How could he protect her from that? "I'm sorry," Michael said, sitting up and reaching for her hand. "I'm so sorry you had to see that." Rihanna shook her head, brushing away a tear. "It's not your fault, Dad. It's Mom. I don't even know who she is anymore." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of what had happened hanging over them. Michael's thoughts drifted to his marriage. How long it had been broken. How he and Jessica had drifted apart. He had known things weren't perfect. But this? He never imagined she would betray him like this. And with Robert, of all people, her first love, the man she had never really let go of. "I don't know what to do now," Michael admitted, his voice cracking. He had spent so long building a life with Jessica, building a family, and now it felt like it had all been swept away in an instant. What was left for him? For Rihanna? Rihanna squeezed his hand, her voice stronger now. "We'll figure it out. We'll get through this. Together." Michael looked at her, seeing a maturity in his daughter that he hadn't fully recognized before. She wasn't a child anymore. She was a young woman who had just watched her family fall apart in front of her eyes. Yet here she was, trying to be strong for him. He pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly, as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded. "I love you, Rihanna," he whispered. "No matter what happens, I'll always love you." "I love you too, Dad," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "We'll be okay. We will." But as they held each other, both of them knew the road ahead was going to be long and painful. The next few days were a blur for Jessica. Michael didn't respond to her texts or calls, and Rihanna was nowhere to be found. The silence from them was unbearable. She spent her time in a fog, replaying the moment in Robert's house over and over in her head, wondering how she could have been so reckless. Robert called a few times, but Jessica ignored his calls. The last thing she wanted was to talk to him. The rush of excitement she had felt with him had faded into a deep, gnawing regret. She didn't blame Robert, he hadn't forced her into anything. But being with him hadn't filled the void like she thought it would. Instead, it had made her feel more lost than ever. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Michael. Jessica's heart ached with every passing hour, but she knew she had to give him space. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now she was paying the price. One evening, as she sat alone in the quiet house, Jessica heard a knock at the door. Her heart leapt with hope. Maybe Michael had finally come home. But when she opened the door, it was Rihanna standing there, her face pale and drawn. "Rihanna," Jessica started, but her daughter held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm not here to stay," Rihanna said, her voice cold and distant. "I just came to get some things." Jessica's heart sank. She wanted to beg her daughter to come inside, to talk, to hear her out. But she could see in Rihanna's eyes that she wasn't ready to forgive her. "Can we just talk?" Jessica pleaded, stepping aside to let her daughter in. Rihanna didn't answer, brushing past her and heading up the stairs to her room. Jessica followed her, trying to find the right words to say, but nothing felt right. "I'm so sorry, Rihanna," Jessica said softly, standing in the doorway of her daughter's room as Rihanna packed a bag. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Rihanna stopped packing and turned to face her mother, her eyes filled with hurt. "Then why did you do it? Why did you lie to us? To Dad? I saw you, Mom. I saw you with him." Jessica felt the tears rising in her throat. "I don't know, honey. I was lost. I didn't know how to deal with everything. Your father and we've been so distant for so long. I didn't mean for it to happen with Robert. It just did." "That's not an excuse," Rihanna snapped, her voice sharp. "You didn't just hurt Dad, you hurt me too. I looked up to you, Mom. I trusted you." Jessica's heart broke as she saw the pain in her daughter's eyes. She had always tried to be a good mother, but in one reckless act, she had shattered that trust. "I know," Jessica whispered, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. Please, just give me a chance to fix this." Rihanna looked at her for a long moment, her expression softening for just a second. But then she turned away, zipping up her bag. "I don't know if I can, Mom," she said quietly. "Not yet." Jessica watched helplessly as Rihanna walked out of the house, leaving her alone once again. As the door closed behind her daughter, the weight of everything she had lost pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had destroyed her marriage. She had broken her family. And now, she didn't know if she'd ever be able to put the pieces back together. The days after Rihanna's visit were some of the darkest Jessica had ever experienced. The house, once filled with the sounds of life, Michael's quiet footsteps, Rihanna's laughter, was now suffocating in its silence. She wandered through the rooms aimlessly, haunted by the ghosts of her past decisions, replaying every moment of her betrayal. She had tried calling Michael again, but his phone had been disconnected. It was clear he wasn't coming back. Jessica could only assume that he and Rihanna were staying in a hotel, or maybe they had found a more permanent place. The thought of them starting a new life without her was unbearable. Yet she knew she had no one to blame but herself. For days, she barely left the house, consumed by guilt and self-loathing. The loneliness gnawed at her. Every minute without her family felt like a lifetime. Robert called a few more times, but Jessica couldn't bear to hear his voice. What had seemed like a passionate rekindling of a long-lost connection had turned into a hollow, meaningless affair. She had allowed her momentary weakness to tear her family apart. One rainy afternoon, as she sat staring out the window, Jessica realized she couldn't continue like this. She had to face the reality of her situation. Michael wasn't coming back. Her marriage was over, and the life she had known for 20 years was gone. But what about Rihanna? Jessica hadn't given up hope that she could repair her relationship with her daughter. Rihanna had left angry and hurt, but she hadn't said it was forever. There was still a sliver of hope. And Jessica knew she had to do whatever it took to make things right with her. The first step was confronting her mistakes, not just with Rihanna, but with herself. A few weeks later, Jessica found herself at a coffee shop she and Michael used to visit on Saturday mornings. She hadn't been back since everything fell apart. But today was different. Today she was meeting Rihanna. It had taken several heartfelt messages. But finally, Rihanna had agreed to meet. Jessica wasn't sure what to expect. Would Rihanna come to forgive her? Would they be able to rebuild any part of their relationship? The questions swirled in her mind, but she tried to quiet them. Today wasn't about getting answers. It was about being open, about showing her daughter that she was willing to change, to atone for her mistakes. When Rihanna walked in, Jessica felt her heart leap in her chest. She looked so grown up, her posture confident, her eyes sharper than Jessica remembered. There was a weight in Rihanna's expression, something Jessica knew she had caused. She stood up to greet her daughter, but Rihanna didn't move to hug her. "Hi," Rihanna said, sitting down across from her. "Hi," Jessica replied, her voice softer than she'd intended. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Jessica had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head, but now that her daughter was sitting in front of her, all the words seemed inadequate. "I'm glad you came," Jessica said, trying to steady her voice. Rihanna nodded but didn't look directly at her. "You said you wanted to talk." Jessica took a deep breath. She knew there was no point in dancing around it. She had to face this head-on. "I know I hurt you, Rihanna. I hurt you and your father. I betrayed you both in the worst way possible, and I'm so sorry for that." She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. "I know I can't take back what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know how much I regret it." Rihanna's eyes were fixed on the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "Why did you do it, Mom?" she asked quietly, finally looking up. "Why Robert? Why now?" Jessica swallowed hard. This was the question she had been dreading the most because the answer was as painful for her to admit as it was for Rihanna to hear. I don't know if there's a good answer, Jessica began slowly. Your father and we drifted apart. For years I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. I was lonely, and I made the mistake of thinking Robert could fill that void. I wasn't thinking about how much it would hurt you or your dad. I was only thinking about myself. Rihanna nodded, her expression unreadable. I used to look up to you, she said softly. I thought you were strong, someone I could always count on. But seeing you with him, it broke something in me. Jessica felt the tears welling up again, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down now. She owed Rihanna more than her tears. She owed her an explanation. I know, Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. I betrayed your trust, and I don't know if I can ever fix that. But I want to try. I want to be someone you can count on again. Someone you can look up to. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. Rihanna stared at her mother for a long moment, and Jessica could see the wheels turning in her head. There was so much pain in her daughter's eyes, so much hurt that Jessica knew she was responsible for. But there was also something else, something that gave Jessica a sliver of hope. I don't know if I can forgive you right now, Rihanna said, her voice thick with emotion. But I don't hate you. I need time. Jessica nodded, understanding that this was as much as she could hope for at the moment. Take all the time you need, she said softly. I'll be here whenever you're ready. For the first time since they had sat down, Rihanna's expression softened. She stood up to leave, but before she walked away, she looked at her mother. Her eyes filled with both sadness and a glimmer of something like love. Goodbye, Mom, Rihanna said, her voice quiet but sincere. Goodbye, sweetheart, Jessica whispered, watching her daughter leave. The conversation hadn't ended in a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. Jessica knew there was a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a small spark of hope. In the weeks that followed, Jessica began to rebuild her life, brick by brick. She moved out of the house she and Michael had shared, knowing it was filled with too many memories of what had been lost. She found a small apartment in town, a place where she could start fresh and begin the long process of healing. She reached out to Michael again, but he remained distant. The divorce papers arrived in the mail one quiet morning, and Jessica sat at her kitchen table, staring at them for a long time before finally signing. She had expected this, but the finality of it still stung. The man she had built a life with for 20 years was no longer hers, and she had no one to blame but herself. But she didn't wallow in self-pity. She started going to therapy, determined to face her mistakes head-on. She needed to understand why she had let things get so far, why she had risked everything for a man who represented the past instead of focusing on what she already had. As the months passed, Jessica began to rediscover herself. Not as a wife or a mother, but as a woman. She took up painting again, something she hadn't done in years, and found solace in creating something beautiful out of the mess her life had become. Slowly, she started to heal piece by piece. Her relationship with Rihanna remained strained, but they were talking. They met for coffee occasionally, the conversation still awkward, but there was a slow rebuilding of trust. Jessica knew it would take time, but she was willing to be patient. She had learned that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required time, effort, and forgiveness. One day, months after the divorce had been finalized, Jessica received a text from Rihanna. Can we talk? I think I'm ready. Jessica stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart swelling with cautious hope. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild what had been broken. And this time she wouldn't take it for granted.